Hi, and welcome to In Search of Insight, Nootropics Depot's monthly podcast. I'm your podcast host, Erika, and sitting next to me is our product specialist at Nootropics Depot, Emiel.
Hey everyone.
Today, Emiel and I are going to be talking about a legendary botanical, something that you might have tried as a candy in the past, which is licorice root.
And we've got some to show you on this episode too, which is kind of unique because we oftentimes don't have the raw botanicals on hand, but licorice is so popular in the Netherlands that you can just walk into a pharmacy and buy licorice roots. So, this is what it looks like. And this is what the whole episode will be about, is these, they look like twigs.
Mm-hmm.
But the funny thing is, so the Glycyrrhizia glabra, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. It's a really difficult Latin name for the botanical. But it's in the bean family, the Fabaceae family of plants. And it grows above ground, quite tall, really big, bushy, and leafy. But the really important part is these roots that grow underneath the ground. And licorice can produce really big roots, so up to 4 meters deep into the ground. So it can take quite a bit of effort to actually dig them up. So these are quite small roots, chopped up into little pieces. And this is not how it looks like fresh. I don't know how close I can get this to the camera, by the way, but this is what it looks like. And they would be much longer, but they get chopped up and they get dried in the sun. And then you have this. And probably in the Netherlands is maybe the only country where we chew on this as a candy. And if you start chewing on it, it takes a little while.
Mm-hmm. It starts to soften up.
And then it gets intensely sweet.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no sugar in here. This is just pure dried licorice root. And there's a compound in here called glyceric acid, which is about 50 times sweeter than sugar. So it's kind of a non-calorie sweetener. However, glyceric acid also has some negative effects on cardiovascular function. And this is one of the reasons why licorice extracts have always intrigued us, but it's always been difficult for us because we don't want to just come out with a full spectrum licorice extract, no matter how interesting that may be, because chronic use of high doses of licorice that has glyceric acid in there can have a negative effect on blood pressure. And if you look at candies in the Netherlands that have licorice root in there, you actually see warnings sometimes. So I found a product that has this. So this product, if you look at the back, right underneath the ingredients, so the ingredients for this is just licorice root extract, and then later on it says bevat zoethout, which means it contains licorice root. Mensen met een hoge bloeddruk dienen overmatig gebruik te vermijden, which means people with existing high blood pressure should not use high amounts of this because it could make your high blood pressure worse. So that's one of the reasons why we started looking at isoliquiritigenin. Which brings us to isoliquiritigenin, because we always try and take the compound that we're going to talk about on this podcast.
Yes. So we're going to take these beautiful little yellow isoliquiritigenin tablets, and you may have a little idea of the effects of isoliquiritigenin if you've seen our now very popular video on YouTube. It was really fun to film that video, and while we were filming this video about the mystical, wonderful effects of isoliquiritigenin, Emiel took quite a few of the isoliquiritigenin tablets, and he was also chewing on a real licorice stick as well. So all the acting that you see there is really inspired by the feeling, the experience of taking the supplement. So we're going to take some of the isoliquiritigenin, we're going to tell you how it feels, about what our experience is like on the podcast itself, and check in throughout to see how the effects might be changing over time. Another thing we're going to do is we're going to show you some traditional candies and talk about some of the traditional uses of licorice root in other cultures in the past as well as currently. And of course, we're going to get really deep into all of the science behind the isoliquiritigenin extract that we have. So let's start by putting our licorice sticks aside and taking some isoliquiritigenin. I already feel a boost. I already feel that the sweetness and the stimulation of the licorice root has started to kick in even from chewing for just a couple of minutes. How about you?
Well, and actually, we did a short take before this, but then we realized our lighting wasn't completely correct. So we've already chewed a little bit of that stick a couple of minutes ago before we reset the lighting. And now this licorice stick on top of it, I do feel kind of an effect. And when we were filming the isoliquiritigenin video, you can see me chewing on a licorice stick the whole time, basically. And that meant I consumed a lot of just full spectrum licorice, and it definitely had a bit of a stimulating, calming, mood boosting effect. Not as strong as isoliquiritigenin, but there's something there. So it's a really interesting botanical. But without further ado, let's try some of this. And I think we should megadose it. What do you think?
Let's do it. Let's megadose it. What would a megadose be in this case?
So a megadose, we're still going to keep it pretty safe. I don't want to take something completely crazy. But like we talked about on the Joe Cohen podcast, sometimes if you take higher doses of something, new effects will pop up. Effects that maybe if you take it continuously, you might actually notice, but not in the acute. But if you take a larger dose, you might notice some interesting effects that you wouldn't with a smaller dose. So I think for this podcast episode, to really get an idea of what it's doing, we'll take 4 tablets. 4 tablets will take us to 100 milligrams of isoliquiritigenin, and the regular dose is 25 milligrams. Now, there's a couple of ways you can consume this isoliquiritigenin, and one of the reasons why it's in a tablet that dissolves in your mouth is so that you can place it underneath your tongue. So here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll take the same. So we can do one of two things with this. We can either take all 4 and let them dissolve in our mouth sublingually, or we can let 2 dissolve sublingually and then swallow the other 2. That way we get some oral effects kicking in later and some quicker effects kicking in now. Or, and this might be the best way to do it so we're not sitting with a mouthful of tablets for too long, we kind of just chew these up, swish them around our mouth, which should really give a nice coating everywhere and underneath our tongue, and that should lead to quite a bit of both buccal through the cheek tissue and sublingual absorption. And then we just swallow it. We don't drink water for a little while because then it stays in your mouth. What strategy would you like to go for?
I think the chewing strategy sounds the most exciting to me. Okay.
Because these are really hard and they actually take a really long time to dissolve, which is nice. You can kind of just take it and park it, but it's going to be really hard to talk and keep it all together and not have something fall out.
Yes.
So let's go for the chewing.
Okay, great.
And before we get into it, I do want to show, I don't know how...
You can get pretty close.
Pretty close?
Yeah.
So see how it's bright yellow? That bright yellow is from the isoliquiritigenin. And if you look at these licorice roots, you can see that they're kind of yellow on the inside too. And it's because a lot of the compounds that are in licorice root, like isoliquiritigenin, are bright yellow. So it's kind of interesting that you can visually see it. And I do think maybe that certain, and it's kind of hidden, maybe if you kind of wet it gets a little bit more yellow. But yeah, that's isoliquiritigenin. It's a yellow compound. Okay, so let's take all of these. And these don't taste like licorice, right?
No.
Like the sweetness is very different. There is a sweetener in there to make it taste nice. But it's a very different taste experience than the licorice itself, which is, how would you describe the taste? Kind of sweet, generic herbal in a sense.
The licorice root itself? I would describe it as sweet, slightly hollow. Maybe there's the hint of a kind of terpene or terpenous spice to it. It also reminds me of chicory root. It reminds me of some other vegetables or botanicals that have a natural sweetness to them, that are used as sweeteners, but that are not sugar. It has that slightly hollow sweetness to it, but it's really pleasant, actually. The longer that I chew on it, the spicier it gets. That's what I notice.
Yeah. because you obviously get to the center of it a little bit more, and then more of those flavor compounds come out. But it's a really interesting flavor. But it wasn't really utilized for its flavor very often. And that's, I think, if we're ready for it, we can start jumping into the history of licorice root.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to share.
Yeah. So if you look at licorice root, you see potentially even the Egyptians were using it. A lot of Southeast Asian cultures were using it. Specifically, traditional Chinese practices use a lot of licorice root. And that's kind of what got us interested in licorice in the first place, because whenever you read through traditional Chinese medicine formulations, you oftentimes see licorice root in there as either the main herb or one of the supporting herbs. You see it combined oftentimes with things like polygala, Panax ginseng, poria mushroom, all of these botanicals which are great at boosting mood and cognition and relaxation. So that's really what got us interested in it. And also, having consumed so much licorice myself, I think the Netherlands actually is the highest consumer of licorice in the world. Some of our neighbors, like Sweden, Norway, Finland, they have different formulations of candies or even liqueurs where you have these like shots that you can get at bars, and it's really popular here too, and they contain licorice root and salmiak salt, which is actually ammonium chloride. We'll get to why that's important in a sec. But we utilize a lot of licorice here, and it's kind of interesting because it's a candy, but it's a candy that's associated with some beneficial health properties too. For example, if you have a cough or you have some mucus, licorice root can actually be helpful at taking away some of that mucus, thinning the mucus out, and suppressing your cough a little bit. So it's definitely used in a functional way too here. And I think that kind of enables our consumption of licorice because it's a candy, but it's also maybe kind of healthy, but it's also kind of bad for you if you eat a lot of it because of the cardiovascular effects. But when you take it all together, it ends up that Dutch people consume an enormous amount of licorice every year. And through consuming, I'm a big fan of licorice too. And when I moved to the US and my licorice supply was basically cut off, I think the first year I barely had any licorice, I started craving it. Like it was almost like a homesick type of thing. But I specifically craved it if I wasn't feeling well. Like if I had a bit of a cold, if I just was feeling a bit low mood, or if I had a headache, I got this craving for licorice. And then I would eat the licorice and some of these symptoms would go away. And if you look at the traditional use of it, these are the kind of things that licorice is being used for. It's being used for headaches, it's being used for stomach cramps and digestion and coughs. And because of that, you see different extracts are being made of it. So in China, you would take these licorice sticks and you would chop it up and you would boil it in water. And that's pretty common for a lot of traditional Chinese herbs. They are cut up, not powderized, just big chunks of it. And maybe Erika can do some editing magic and we can show some picture here or here, wherever is a good place to place it, of what some of these traditional Chinese medicine formulations actually look like. And oftentimes it's sliced dried herbs that you then extract in water, and then you discard the herbs and you drink the tea. And that's a similar thing of how licorice is used. But then it's taken a little bit further. So you could take these licorice sticks, you dry them, you chop them up, you put them in water, and you extract it in water. And you make a really strong extract of it. And then you take that water extract and you boil it down. And while you're boiling it down, the extract becomes really concentrated and black. And that's, you asked a good question the other day. Why is licorice actually black? Because it's yellow.
Yes.
And it's black because when you make that water extract and you concentrate it by evaporating the water, the extract turns black.
Okay.
And the raw material for all licorice then is black. And interestingly, you can actually buy raw licorice extract here. And it's a really acquired taste. And you have to go all the way back to Italy in the 1700s to discover where this came from. So probably because of a lot of travel from Europe to Southeast Asia and trade routes and exploitation, of course. Always have the disclaimer that some nasty stuff happened back then. But
to get the botanicals from one part of the world to the other part of the world.
But because there was so much trade, we ended up picking up licorice roots and seeing how they're being traditionally used there, making water extracts. So then back in Italy in the 1700s, they started making these more higher potency extracts with water and boiling them down. And then you get this black goop. And if you let that black goop set, it becomes hard and really sticky. And I guess Italians at the time had a lot of bay leaves. So they would make these big blocks of this licorice water extract. And to prevent those blocks from sticking to each other, they would layer bay leaves in between. That was a good way to prevent them sticking. But also, this block is absorbing some of the flavors from the bay leaf into it. So then you have something called bay leaf licorice, which is this.
Or la lyre in this case.
La lyre drop. And another interesting thing, we call licorice drop here, D-R-O-P, as you can maybe read here. And I was actually kind of curious, where does this name come from?
Yeah.
And it comes from the fact that licorice wasn't always a candy, and it was an extract that you would get in a bottle, and you would take little drops of it.
Okay.
So then, once it became a candy, it was called drop.
Whenever Emiel is craving licorice, well, actually, whenever I go to the store and Emiel's not with me, I always bring home bags of droppies. That's what we call it. Well, that's what I learned from Emiel, because that's what he calls it. So it's fun to learn the background of where all of these words and the candy and the traditional uses come from.
Absolutely. And that traditional style of... And this, again, is not a candy. Now it's a candy.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a candy back then, because it was an Italian pharmacist that was making this extract, making these blocks, and then kind of just chopping up the blocks. And then you take this chunk of basically like a resin extract, and you suck on it, and that's good for making your cough go away, and it has interesting health benefits. And that's the first time, I think, licorice started becoming more of a refined product. And because of that, if you look at this, even now it says real Italian la lyre drop. And if you look at the ingredients, the only thing in here is licorice root extract. So this is, if I can open it, this is basically as pure as it gets.
Wow. Yeah, it's really dark. And for anyone who's wondering if red vines count as licorice, no, they don't.
They don't. Absolutely not.
Red vines might be called licorice, but they're not real licorice. The real stuff is usually going to be quite dark, black in color.
And let's taste this, and you're going to notice something interesting.
Okay.
So how would you describe the taste?
Well, it's actually sour at first. I don't find it to be
I wouldn't call it sour, by the way, but...
Okay. Well, it's quite bitter.
It's bitter.
Yeah, I taste the bay leaf or the la lyre right away. The licorice sweetness does come through. There's definitely some saltiness as well. I find that...
But not a whole lot.
No, not a whole lot, and these are not salted. That's another element of the drop of the licorice that we're going to discuss a little bit later, is the inclusion of salt as well.
Ammonium chloride.
Yes.
Yeah.
But for me, sometimes I confuse bitter with sour. Like sometimes I find that unpleasant flavor in coffee, like overbrewed or underbrewed espresso, for example. That line between bitter and sour can sometimes get a little bit blurry for me, but I would say now I'm tasting it more, it definitely has a bit of a bitterness to it, and a little bit of a hollow sweetness. It's getting better over time, but these are intense.
This is really intense, and this is just straight up unrefined extract, water extract. So the licorice root is boiled in water, the roots are removed from the water, and then that water extract is boiled down till you get a resin, and that resin hardens up, and you get what we just showed you. And it's sweet, it's bitter, it's really intense, but there's nothing in it. This is what licorice root extract tastes like in its purest form.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna drink some water because it's really intense in flavor.
Yeah. And I like this flavor, but this is really more of a more like medicinal type of flavor.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing I was hoping you might notice is in the US, and I think a lot of foreign countries, when you think of licorice, that flavor of licorice is not licorice root.
Yeah.
It's aniseed.
Oh, okay.
Aniseed is oftentimes added as a flavoring agent to make, because this isn't very pleasant, right?
No.
So to turn this into a candy, you add sugar, you add all sorts of stuff, and then you add some flavorings like aniseed, which is really complementary to the taste of licorice. And a little bit of saltiness too.
Yeah.
That complements it. And it dilutes what we're tasting now, because this is, even for me, this is intense.
Mm-hmm.
But abroad, you often associate aniseed with licorice flavor, and I've drank like licorice or aniseed liqueurs with Americans, and they've said, "Oh, it tastes like licorice." Or if you have absinthe,
yeah.
I've also heard people comparing it to licorice.
Yeah.
But it doesn't taste like licorice.
Yeah.
It tastes like the licorice candy because it oftentimes has aniseed in it, but this is really what licorice tastes like, and you taste it in the stick too. It's an interesting flavor, but it's nothing crazy.
Yeah, actually, it's funny that you said you hoped I would taste something, but I think what you meant was you hoped that I wouldn't taste something, or that I would notice that this something wasn't there, and I didn't consider it when I was first tasting it, but now I realize there's a little bit of that sparkle, I guess, missing, and the aniseed flavor is something I really like. I didn't eat so much aniseed, really. It wasn't such a popular spice or food for me to eat in the past, but whenever I would eat it, usually after a really delicious Indian meal, like the coated aniseeds, that was always a really special and like delicious flavor. But I didn't realize that anise was included in the kind of flavor profile of licorice itself.
Oftentimes. Not in all licorice, but mostly there's a little bit of aniseed flavor there to kind of round everything out. And some licorice is really high in that aniseed flavor. And I think because of that, and also I think, have you ever had the red vines, but when they're black, the black licorice version?
Yes.
Do those taste like aniseed?
They're so sweet, and they don't really have a strong licorice flavor, not compared to any of the licorice that we eat here. Yeah.
But yeah, this is pure licorice flavor, and and this will definitely have an effect too.
I feel it, actually.
And I don't know if you can feel this, but I feel it coating my whole throat a little bit.
Yes.
And if you're having a cough, it's really common to go get something intense like this and suck on it. And because it's not being diluted, and you're not supposed to chew this. It's pretty bad if you chew this because it sticks to your teeth.
It's very sticky.
And then your teeth get all black. So you just have to suck on this. And because it's so concentrated and viscous almost, it kind of coats your throat. And it's really good for a cough. So, but that's, I think, where the story gets really interesting. And we're going to pull out another botanical soon to help round that story out.
Yes.
But usually candies or certain drinks first started as botanical remedies many, many years ago. When we didn't have modern medicine, we just had these botanicals, and you had to process these botanicals in a certain way. So this is why this Italian person, I forget his name, but he, in I think 1760, made what we're chewing on now as a product to sell in a pharmacy for things like a cough or maybe some indigestion, something like that. Became quite popular, I guess. And then British people were tasting it too, and I guess they didn't really like this flavor. So in England, they actually started adding things like gum arabic and sugar to actually make it into more of a candy, make it more palatable. And the British actually did this before with tonic water. So tonic water also was actually first born out of more of a medical use. So I believe it was the British Navy, they figured out that if you take quinine from the cinchona tree, I believe, there's a compound in there that has a positive effect on malaria infections. Or
Wow.
I guess a negative effect, because it takes away some of the malaria infection. So it makes it less likely.
Oh.
But it's super bitter. So if you just take pure cinchona bark extract or quinine sulfate, it's really bitter and it's unpleasant. But if you put it in some water, some soda water, and then you add gin, it tastes really nice. And you have less chances of getting malaria.
And then you have a reason to drink more gin and tonics, which is always good, for sure.
Exactly. But the interesting thing is, of course, don't take this as if you're going to a malaria-infested country, don't just rely on tonic water because it doesn't work anymore. I guess the malaria virus has changed and adapted over time. This isn't as effective anymore. But it is kind of interesting that you can take these more medicinal type of herbs that have a long history for those uses, and you can turn it into something pleasurable, something that tastes nice. Of course, also an acquired taste. Not everyone likes tonic water, but I think that's an interesting thing.
Really fascinating. And it's also something, this quinine is also something that's used in other liquors and liqueurs as well, to add a bitter element, to add a little bit of a depth of flavor. And when I was making cocktails, I really was so passionate about cocktail recipe creation when I was a cocktail bartender. There were all different kinds of amaros and liquors and even fortified wines that were using quinine or quinone.
Quinine sulfate usually.
Yeah, quinine.
Yeah. Or cinchona bark extract if you want to be a little bit more natural.
As a preserving agent, but also as a flavor agent as well. And it's really fascinating to think about the shift from using these botanicals as, medicinal botanicals or really as functional parts of keeping yourself well, back however many hundreds of years. And then slowly, perhaps our cultures or some cultures have moved toward more of a luxurious pleasure kind of fueled food and beverage consumption. But we're still actually consuming these, medicinal botanicals in the cocktails that we drink, or in liquors, or in candies, things that we might now associate just with fun and relaxed time and just pleasure, but they do still have all of that history behind them. I find that just super fascinating.
Absolutely. And when you're talking about these fortified wines like Vermouth, they were also first developed in Italy as, actually, now that I think about that, vermouth I think maybe comes from Germany, because I think the word vermouth is the German word for wormwood, which is one of the famous or infamous botanicals in absinthe. And
what's now, because German and Dutch are related, what is the Dutch word for wormwood? Do you know it?
It's a great question.
Well, now I'm thinking how you might pronounce it.
Wormwood.
Okay, got it.
And it's because you take wormwood, which is Artemisia vulgaris, I believe, and that was being extracted into wine. And if you look at the ancient Egyptians, apparently they were taking blue lotus and extracting it into wine. And if you go through history, we've extracted a lot of botanicals into wine because you have water and you have ethanol in there, so you're making dual water ethanol extracts, basically.
Wine extracts.
Yeah. And
genius.
And they were really being used more as like a medical tool, not necessarily as something to drink for pleasure.
Yeah.
But because you have to use this anyways, and it's good for you, and it has some general health properties too, there's incentive to make things taste nice. So vermouth started tasting nicer. Things like absinthe started to come about. Amaros. And Amaros, we're big fans of Amaros, but those really came about because of their medicinal properties. And then you start adapting those medicinal properties into something that tastes nice and still kind of has those properties. And I think it's interesting, if I look around in the US, if you look at a lot of the candy and a lot of the drinks, maybe Coca-Cola is one example where Not anymore. I wouldn't say Coca-Cola is healthy at this point.
No, I'm going to say absolute no on that one.
But back in the day, it probably wasn't as sweet. It was laced with way more herbs, and of course, a really infamous one that we shall not mention here.
Yes.
But it had some interesting medicinal properties. And
same thing with root beer, for example.
root beer too, yeah. But I think a lot of that has started to become lost everywhere.
And perhaps the actual inspiration hasn't been lost. I mean, there's all kinds of really small soda companies that are making interesting sodas with different botanicals, but the awareness or perhaps the knowledge of where these flavors come from and the ingredients that create these flavors, that's not being shared quite as much, and that's not maybe as relevant or as interesting to people when you compare like this historical botanical usage to like the really spectacular Coca-Cola commercials. You know, we just see it as Coca-Cola Red, but it has a way longer history before Coca-Cola was even a brand.
Yeah. And some of the herbs in there that should have been in a traditional Coca-Cola, like cola nut, or even the leaf that we will not talk about, which I have sampled one time when we were in Chile, going up a mountain because of its properties for altitude sickness. They have some really interesting effects. So I'm sure a Coca-Cola from whenever that was first, around like the 1800s or something like that, probably had some really interesting beneficial effects.
Yeah.
But you start making it taste better and better and better, and then you also maybe lose some of those properties. So if we're thinking now about the Italians that were making this really intense extract that was then being dried on bay leaves, probably chock full of all sorts of interesting bioactives. And now, okay, that's interesting, but let's make it a little bit more palatable. You take it over to England, they start adding sugar to it, gum arabic, and then you end up with something. Actually, let's start with this one first. This is Erika's favorite, the honey. This is a nice one to kind of rinse our palate.
This is the starter. This is kind of droppies with training wheels. This is the honing drop, which is really, really tasty. It's soft, it's chewy. It really has a strong beeswax honey flavor to it, and it also has a nice, I wouldn't say mild, but I would say really pleasant licorice flavor.
And so, if you smell it, it has that similar licorice aroma that you get from those sticks.
But the honey is also super strong. And
honey was traditionally being added as one of the sweeteners, and honey, of course, also has some nice soothing effects. And
all kinds of good properties.
A lot of modern licorice is being made with gelatin, but a lot of the older licorice is being made with gum arabic. And this company in the Netherlands, they're kind of making licorice more according to traditional recipes. So this one's also made with gum arabic. So it's a little bit more... I guess it's pretty strong, actually.
It is pretty strong.
Yeah, but it has a different overall, like, if you bite into it. But
it has a different texture. Yeah.
Yeah. But this one, especially with the honey flavor, this is probably as close as what you might have gotten in England back in the day. So you take what we just sampled from Italy, and now we're advancing a few years, and now we're in England, and now we're tasting kind of what the English pharmacists were doing with it. And again, it's not being used as a candy at this point. It's really being used more of a functional botanical.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to enjoy this licorice, but now I have a question for you. Because there's a licorice candy called Engelsdrop, which means English drop. But do you know anything about the history behind Engelsdrop or where that comes from?
I don't, but the flavor profile of that is the most accessible. Like, if you don't like licorice, you can eat Engelsdrop, which translates to English licorice. It's super sweet. It doesn't have a lot of that licorice flavor in there. And if you look at this licorice we're eating now, you're really starting with that block. And you call it block drop, I think. And that's kind of the raw material that you then dilute. And I guess in some of the later English drop, it gets more and more and more diluted and more and more sweet.
Okay.
This is quite sweet. And it's still missing that aniseed flavor.
Yeah.
So that must have come a little bit later
Okay.
as well.
One thing also about the Engelstrop is that you have these other kinds of candy flavors with it. So there's different colors and there's slightly different flavors that are kind of an external or even an internal coating along with the licorice. So it really is more of a candy and like a confection, treat. It doesn't look just plain black.
Yeah. So yeah, that's this licorice kind of moving on to England. And now that licorice is coming to the Netherlands, to Germany, to Finland, Norway, all of these countries. And I guess one thing we were doing for thinning out our mucus and for coughs was adding ammonium chloride. So ammonium chloride, when it enters your mouth, the chloride dissociates from the ammonia and you just have some ammonia in your mouth. And if you've ever worked in the hospitality industry, you've probably used your ammonium cleaner. I don't know if you've ever seen this at the bar you worked at.
Yeah.
But the cafe I worked at, we just had ammonia, diluted ammonia in a spray bottle, and you spray surfaces down, and the ammonia has antibacterial properties.
I most associate ammonia with a quick cure for a jellyfish sting. That's one use where I needed to use ammonia, just like as a topical. The other thing I associate ammonia with is very random, but the smell of horse piss. It really smells like ammonia. In fact, there might be ammonia in...
There is, and there's actually...
Horse pee, sorry, that's a little bit rude.
Horse urine.
Urine, let's reel it back a little bit. Horse urine.
And actually in our urine, there's ammonia too, which is why there's this concept that if you do get stung by a jellyfish, you can just pee on your leg or have one of your friends pee on your leg, which I don't think is that effective. But part of it is that there is some ammonia in your urine.
And it's antibacterial.
But here, if you take ammonium chloride and you take that ammonium chloride and you consume it, one, it can thin out your mucus, so it can be easier to expel mucus if you're having a cough or you're congested. And the ammonium chloride is acting as an antibacterial, so whatever is causing those issues, it can have potentially a beneficial effect on the root cause. And I guess when the licorice kind of went from Italy to England and back to this part of the world where we were also using ammonium chloride, those two eventually met, and we call it salmiak, which is... Salmiak, I think, generally is just ammonium chloride. It has a salty taste. And usually it's mixed with just licorice powder. So I got some of that too.
Oh boy.
We're really going full into the licorice.
Oh my goodness.
We're going to consume every form of it. So
I must say I'm like a little bit nervous for this one because I still have the La Lia drop, the Italian one.
Oh, you still have it?
Yeah, I mean, it's still dissolving in my mouth. It's pretty bitter. But I haven't ever taken this powder before, and I really don't know what to expect. When Emiel and I first met, it was a really funny joke for Emiel to give me licorice with salmiak salt on it, and tell me that it was...
on the inside.
Okay, yeah, hidden on the inside. And he would tell me that it was a nice candy and I should try it. And then I would eat it and would just be absolutely repulsed. I mean, I had never tasted candy with salt in it before. Never in my life.
Or ammonium chloride, because it tastes salty, but it's ammonium chloride, not sodium chloride, which we associate with salt, which is also kind of weird.
Yeah, but it took me years to get used to the flavor of the ammonium chloride in the licorice. And now I find it's okay. I will eat it. It's not something I reach for. But I never imagined that I would be eating the pure ammonium chloride licorice powder.
And this is not pure ammonium chloride. So this is ammonium chloride mixed with powderized root. So let's see. There is licorice root extract in here, some sugar, salmiak salt, so the ammonium chloride, and then rice flour. And then actually a little bit of salt. And again, there's the warning on here that don't use it if you have high blood pressure. So
okay, I just swallowed the rest of my drop because I need to make room for this experience. One question I have for you. The name of this powder is... Oh, it smells nice. The name of this powder is Zwart-Wit Drop. Oh no, sorry, Zwart-Wit Zout.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to translate it, it's black, white, salt.
Salty.
But why is there black and white? I mean, I understand where the black comes from with the licorice, but where does the white come from?
The ammonium chloride.
Hey!
Which is white. It's just a white crystalline powder.
All right.
Okay, so this is kind of gross. You need to have your own pot, but I'll kind of hit an area. So you just make your finger wet, you stick it in there.
This is a traditional way to do it.
Yeah, you get a nice little coating.
Ah!
Well, it's not too intense.
Okay. This reminds me of those dippin' sticks that I would eat in the U.S. as a kid. Those are nice.
And this is quite bitter too. There's a lot of licorice root extract in here.
I really like this actually. That's very tasty. This tastes like licorice. This has that slightly hollow sweetness that goes to the side of your mouth and also the back of your mouth that I experience with the licorice root. That's really nice actually. Now I'm thinking, what could I use this with in terms of cooking? Maybe it would be nice to sprinkle on cookies, like molasses cookies, for example. And that was an inspired idea to mention molasses cookies, but it also reminds me of the research that we were doing before the podcast, which we found out that molasses is commonly used as a sweetener for licorice as well. And that can contribute to its flavor and also its color.
Not in the Netherlands, it seems. More in Scandinavian companies. So if you've ever seen the Lakrids, the kind of fancy licorice that's going all over the world now, they're using molasses. And that's probably why theirs is maybe a little bit more black too. Okay. Here it's really just that licorice extract is black. And that's why black licorice is black.
But I can imagine that this would combine really well with a molasses cookie, or even with another cookie, perhaps. I mean, of course, if you were into making your own chocolates or your own candies, this could be something nice to coat your candies with. It makes it so that your candies don't stick together. Yeah. But it's a really nice flavor, and it's not too intense, and it's not too salty.
Yeah, this is actually, I would have expected it to be a bit saltier, but there's actually a much higher concentration of licorice extract in here. So what I'm getting hit with more is that kind of herbal bitterness, that's slightly hollow sweetness. But this was probably a very common form of what you would get in a pharmacy here. If you had a cough or something like that, you would get this powder, and you would just consume this powder. But then you take this powder and you take the concepts of the British, and then you end up with one of our final forms, which is mildly salty licorice.
And in Dutch, you would say
mild zout.
Yes.
So it gets more intensely salty, but this is about... this is a nice middle of the road. And actually, I think it's the European Union. They've tried to limit the Netherlands and other Scandinavian countries in how much ammonium chloride they can actually use in food products to 0.3%. Because they think ammonium chloride it's not great to be consuming large amounts of it, and the fact that it is an antimicrobial compound for your gut health, it is probably not a great idea to be consuming large amounts of ammonium chloride. And so they tried to limit it to 0.3%, and basically everyone said, you can do that with all of our food products, make it 0.3%, but don't touch our licorice, because most licorice, or some licorice, can get up to 7% ammonium chloride by weight.
Wow.
So it can get really salty, and especially in Scandinavian countries, they can be really intensely salty. This is probably way over 0.3% as well. So...
just keep that in mind.
They passed the law, but they made the exception for licorice. So licorice, we can put as much ammonium chloride as we want in there.
Interesting. So perhaps it's a good idea to then take some probiotics after you eat your licorice.
Potentially, yeah.
All
Cheers.
Right. Cheers.
And now I think we're getting the
anise.
The anise.
For sure.
Yeah, it doesn't say it's in here.
No? Well,
but I definitely taste aniseed.
Me too.
That's kind of funny that it doesn't list it on here.
Yeah.
And this actually also contains molasses.
Okay.
But this is more what I would assume someone in the US would associate with licorice. Like, it's a little bit salty, and it's a little bit aniseedy. A flavor profile that I really like, and I think a lot of Americans don't enjoy it.
Not so much, but I do think it's sort of an acquired taste. You either love it or you hate it. And my mom always loved black licorice, like really, really loved it. And I was never a fan of it. But I remember she would really like Good and Plenty's, which are pretty dark, pretty serious licorice flavor. But I was never into it as a kid. So my mom loved it. I didn't love it. And I think perhaps some other family members of mine were really, really into licorice, but it was kind of a split thing, sort of a polarizing flavor for people.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
But now you can imagine you have the beneficial effects of licorice. Especially, it can be acting as a cough suppressant. And you have the ammonium chloride, which can thin your mucus and has that antimicrobial effect. And it tastes nice.
Yeah.
For me, not for everyone.
Yeah.
For you, it tastes nice too, but it's a really acquired taste. But it really is more of a thing that you would have in pharmacies that got used so much, it just became a part of the culture. And to the point where we eat millions of kilos of licorice every year.
Yeah.
But of course, you don't always want to be consuming that amount of glyceric acid. So for me, I definitely don't eat licorice on a daily basis.
Almost daily basis. I mean, it depends. And of course, the licorice candies that we're eating together, I don't think they have such a huge concentration of
They will.
the actual... they will.
Yeah, because if it has like that nice sweet taste, that's the glyceric acid. That's the part that's not so great about
maybe
it.
we have to... Well, it's good. I don't buy licorice every time I go to the store. Maybe every other time I go to the store. So now I will think about another sweet treat because
But what I was
we really
going to
do,
say...
enjoy it a lot.
I don't eat licorice every day.
No.
I definitely don't. I didn't eat any basically this last week. But when I get licorice, I just binge on the licorice. So I eat a large amount of it, and then I kind of put it out of my system. It's really like my guilty pleasure. I love licorice. And sometimes at the bar, they have the Salmari stuff, which is like a liquefied shot of licorice, and it's salty.
It's very salty. It's very intense.
But don't eat it consistently. But those mood effects are really nice. So, of course... I'm eating a bunch of sugar. It's a nice flavor. It's nostalgic. It's I've grown up with it. It just makes me feel good because it tastes good and how it tastes, but also because of the bioactives. And that really brings us to the most important part of this podcast, is to actually discuss isoliquiritigenin.
And to reference our title, which is that isoliquiritigenin is candy for your brain, and to talk about the mood benefits from isoliquiritigenin, which comes from licorice root. So before we jump straight into that, I do want to check in with you and ask how the effects are and what you're feeling from the isoliquiritigenin tablets. Now we've also added all of these licorice candies on top of that, so that might be adding to the effects as well.
Yeah.
But tell me, what are you feeling with your mood? What are you feeling physically? And at what point did you start to notice those changes taking place?
It's still somewhat mild for me, and part of the reason probably is also because I'm focused on telling the story and the history of licorice and presenting all of these licorice candies. But now that I if I sit still for a second, I'm starting to feel something. The one interesting thing to note for me is with the isoliquiritigenin, it takes a little while to kick in. I actually seem to have things kick in much slower for me when compared to some of the other people on our team. So for me, I'm not totally at an effects level yet that I'm used to, especially with how high of a dose we've taken, which, by the way, I've never gone over 75 milligrams, so that's 3 tablets, so this is kind of unexplored territory too. But what I can notice is like a distinct kind of focus effect. It's calming, but it's also focusing, and I think right now what I'm getting the most of is more of the focus, and I would liken it to a bit of that caffeine L-theanine type of experience, but a little bit smoother. But I'm definitely starting to feel, especially now that I'm sitting still, like things feel a little bit more weightless. Like my body feels a bit more relaxed, which we'll talk about why that happens in a sec. But yeah, a little bit more physically relaxed, a little bit more mentally relaxed, but also more focused. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of isoliquiritigenin. What are you feeling so far?
I definitely noticed the relaxation in my throat, in my mouth, in my vocal cords. And you were talking about it earlier, and talking about how licorice can help with, loosening up, or the ammonium sulfate? Chloride. The ammonium chloride can help loosen up mucus, and the licorice itself can be sort of anti-inflammatory. And I definitely feel that my throat is relaxed. Perhaps that's partially from the isoliquiritigenin, perhaps that's also from the candies, but I definitely feel that for sure. And I think my whole throat, mouth area also feels very moisturized, if I can say that. It feels very fluid and like there's nothing blocking. I'm not getting any kind of like urge that I have to cough at all. So I'm feeling that quite a bit. I'm also feeling...
Which, interesting to note, we cut out certain parts sometimes because for some reason, if you're really focused on talking on a podcast, it's way different than just chatting to a friend, because you're trying to articulate really nicely, you're trying to do it at a certain volume, and you're very focused, and you're trying not to make as many mouth sounds. So if I were to just be out in public and talking to someone or on a call with someone, I'd be swallowing a lot more, I'd be kind of swishing my mouth around a bit more. But if we do that, then you start picking up all of these weird mouth sounds on camera, and it doesn't sound nice. So you kind of have to train yourself for that. But for me, and for you, at a certain point, we just kind of have a coughing fit.
In the podcast. Yeah. For me, not as much. I think that's because I have experience recording voiceovers, but also recording myself singing. And so I definitely have learned over time how to manage mucus in a way where you can't even hear it when I'm speaking, or where you can't even hear it when I'm singing, which is something that you can be trained to do, but you can also just learn how to do it over time. But I definitely noticed it with you, and it used to be worse when we first started the podcast. Now it's not so bad, but there can come a time, especially in a stressful moment, or if we've had like an intense setup, where your voice starts to react to that stress and you start to cough. But that hasn't happened a single time on this episode.
And I feel like you were saying, everything is a little bit more moisturized, and my voice feels more relaxed, or my vocal cords. So that's kind of an interesting effect. Something I've never, of course, paid attention to with licorice, because I've never consumed this amount of licorice and then talked in front of a camera.
For an extended
period of time. I did do it, of course, with isoliquiritigenin video.
Yes, yes.
But there's definitely some sort of effect, and it's nice. And I might notice like an effect in my stomach a little bit, where it's slightly relaxing. And that's likely more coming from the licorice extracts and the licorice root that we were chewing on earlier, rather than isoliquiritigenin.
I definitely feel a bit of a warming effect in my stomach, which is not something that I experience with a whole lot of supplements. I do sometimes feel like more open or more relaxed, but this really has like a warming kind of effect to it. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting, and the more I talk about it now, the more I start to feel the effects coming on. Like it's clearly GABA-ergic. So I think we can do one of two things. You get to decide. We didn't talk about our new products yet.
Yes,
so
that's true.
So we can break and do that, or we can get into the pharmacology of isoliquiritigenin.
I think we should jump straight into the pharmacology, because we've done such a great build-up with all of these candies, but we've also dropped a few of the hints about the mechanisms of action for the benefits of isoliquiritigenin. So let's get into it.
Absolutely. So one of the things I was mentioning is that I felt a bit of physical relaxation. I'm not sure if you've started to notice that.
Yes.
And part of that is because isoliquiritigenin is acting as a GABA-B agonist. So there's two types. It's a bit more complex, but let's simplify it. There's two types of GABA receptors. The GABA-A receptor, which is made up of a bunch of different subunits, which is why it's a bit more complicated than there only being two different GABA receptors, because how the GABA-A receptor is constructed with all of the different subunits makes a big difference into how it acts when it gets activated. So, but let's forget about that for now. We have GABA-A, which we'll talk about shortly, and then we have GABA-B. And GABA-B receptors seem to control physical, like muscle tension and things like that a bit more. So if you activate GABA-B, things relax. In your gut, that can happen, so you have this relaxation effect in your gut. It's probably where some of the gastrointestinal effects of licorice are coming from, would be this minor GABA-B agonism, which is significantly elevated in isoliquiritigenin, of course, because we have a much higher concentration of it. And it has a nice mood effect. So we always like GABA-B agonism, but you almost never find it in nature. So that was a really interesting thing for us to discover when we started looking at licorice root and what was in there, and then we find isoliquiritigenin, and then we find, hey, it's a GABA-B agonist. That was the moment where we knew, okay, we have to start looking at isoliquiritigenin. I think that's going to be the key to capturing licorice's mood-boosting effects, amplifying them a bit, and removing the risk of glyceric acid. Isoliquiritigenin is also a GABA-A agonist. So that's also nice. Actually, I believe it's a GABA-A positive allosteric modulator together with straight-up GABA-B agonism. So those two together, you get the more mentally relaxing effects from that GABA-A portion, and you get some more of those physically relaxing effects from the GABA-B portion. So just that alone is really interesting and would make isoliquiritigenin a top choice for us, because I personally am a huge fan of GABAergics. Paul is also a big fan of GABAergics. You're a big fan of GABAergics. It seems like we're all kind of fans of GABAergics around the office. So especially GABA-B agonists, we really like those, and we've been missing a GABA-B agonist, so it was really interesting to find isoliquiritigenin. And then when we tried it, we noticed, hey, it's also a bit stimulating. It's not just relaxing, and it actually doesn't really make us tired. In fact, I would never take this before bed, because it's starting to kick in a little bit more now.
Yeah.
I'm starting to get, I feel like that kind of chatty effect.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go a bit faster. I'm getting a bit more physical energy now. Yeah. There's definitely a stimulating component to it, and that's because isoliquiritigenin is an inhibitor of both monoamine oxidase A and monoamine oxidase B. So it's a dual MEO inhibitor.
Wow.
And what that means, we've discussed this multiple times on the podcast already, but just a quick refresher. There's multiple different ways in which neurotransmitters can become degraded or removed from the synaptic cleft. So to back up just a little bit more, the basics of neurotransmission is you get an electrical signal which goes into the presynaptic neuron, and that presynaptic neuron is full of little things called vesicles. They're these little circles, and they get packed with neurotransmitters, and then those neurotransmitters float around in the presynaptic neuron. They bind to the cellular membrane, and when that happens, a process kicks in that then opens up the vesicle and the cellular membrane, and the neurotransmitter can be released into a fluid-filled cavity called the synaptic cleft. When it's floating around in there, it can interact on the opposite side, which you call the postsynaptic neuron, which is where receptors for those neurotransmitters are. Those neurotransmitters can bind to those receptors, and then they go off the receptor again, because it's not a very strong bond, and it's kind of a chaotic system in there. So you have these neurotransmitters going on and off, on and off, on and off on the receptor, which is causing electrical signals to be sent, and then the process repeats. And then that electrical signal in the next presynaptic neuron triggers another event of neurotransmitter release. But it's important that you also remove these neurotransmitters so you don't get constant activation. And there's three main ways that happens. One of them is diffusion. It just floats off into nowhere, and then it can't interact with these receptors anymore. Or another thing that can happen, well, two things that can happen. One of them is that these monoamine oxidase enzymes, they float in, and they just degrade the neurotransmitter. And by doing that, it gets inactivated. So if you look at, for example, dopamine is mostly degraded by monoamine oxidase B, If you look at serotonin, it's mostly being degraded by monoamine oxidase A, and monoamine oxidase A is also more specific to norepinephrine. So all of those neurotransmitters are being broken down by monoamine oxidase. Or you can have transporters kind of grab those neurotransmitters and put them back into the presynaptic neuron, awaiting another release event. But what to tie it into isoliquiritigenin, if you block the monoamine oxidase enzymes, you lose 1 out of 3 main pathways by which neurotransmitters are removed. So you're slowing down the degradation, which means more dopamine, more norepinephrine, more serotonin is staying in that synaptic cleft and has a higher likelihood of activating the receptor. And that means you have more monoamine neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and dopamine, which can be stimulating, and serotonin, which can be mood boosting and a little bit relaxing. And you're amplifying that.
So I just want to jump in for a second, because as you've been describing these whole processes, I'm starting to feel really relaxed and really, really laid back, almost to the point where I feel a little bit sleepy.
Interesting.
And this is interesting because sometimes we have some opposite experiences with certain compounds. And as you were describing, basically the effects of this monoamine oxidase inhibition, which causes more of these neurotransmitters to build up in your brain. I was thinking that I must be producing more serotonin, right? Or, I mean, perhaps I'm producing some more serotonin. Or is norepinephrine also one that can have this kind of relaxing effect?
Norepinephrine, by the way, is really badly understood by most people. We usually associate norepinephrine. So norepinephrine, another name for it is noradrenaline.
Yes, so it wouldn't make sense to have a calming effect from norepinephrine.
Well,
right?
And that's kind of where it gets difficult, because a lot of people think norepinephrine always means you're going to get more stimulated, but it's not always the case. And norepinephrine can actually be slightly relaxing in a way that it enhances focus in the right amount.
Okay.
You increase that, then it definitely gets more physically stimulating, especially. But there's also some nice memory enhancing and cognition enhancing effects associated with it.
Okay.
What you're probably feeling the most is the GABA-A and GABA-B modulation.
Yes.
And maybe for you, the monoamine oxidase inhibition effects haven't kicked in as much yet. And I do think you do seem to be quite sensitive to monoamine oxidase inhibition too.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
But basically, you have this contrast of GABA-A and GABA-B going up, the activation of both of those. So you have more inhibition happening in your brain. But then you also have more of these monoamine neurotransmitters coming up, which then is stimulating for most people. Not everyone, by the way. Not everyone has a stimulating effect with monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which is kind of interesting. Some people just experience nothing from Vignatex or Tribugen. And I believe, and I've mentioned this on the previous podcast, I believe, with Lucas, that some people just have very low levels of monoamine oxidase already. So if you try to inhibit it, not a whole lot is happening there. And people who usually have higher levels of monoamine oxidase, which according to my genetic testing, I seem to have higher levels of monoamine oxidase A and B. For me, I'm very sensitive to monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So that's kind of why I came up with this theory. I'm not sure how correct that is, but it does seem... I know one other person who actually has low monoamine oxidase A and B levels determined by genetic testing. Again, we're not sure how accurate that is, but they notice nothing from Vignatex or Tribulus, whereas for me it's really stimulating. So there might be something there. Your levels might be different. You've never gotten your genetics tested, so maybe there's something there.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because you have this calming effect being contrasted with a stimulating effect if you respond to the monoamine oxidase inhibition effect. And those two together create an effects profile that's like super amplified L-theanine, or caffeine L-theanine, where you get that same synergy between a stimulating component and a calming component. Now it's just happening in one extract or one compound. And that compound is also producing even smoother effects, but also more mood elevating effects.
Yeah. If anything, I would say that this kind of relaxation this is the relaxation that I have when I say to you, I'm feeling a little bit tired. And you say, are you sure you're tired, or are you just really, really relaxed? And this is that feeling where I even feel it in my facial muscles, or especially my facial muscles, like around my eyes and kind of the back of my head, like these muscles that I don't normally even sense are clenching or really working. And now I'm sitting here and having this conversation with you, and it just feels like from the hairs on my head all the way through my toes, my whole body is just relaxed. And perhaps this is also happening because now it's been over an hour since we took the isoliquiritigenin tablets, and at first I was feeling a lot of stimulation. That can also be because we started the podcast. But now I'm really feeling those relaxing effects starting to really set in. And I'm curious, for anyone who's taken isoliquiritigenin, do you also notice that there is kind of an initial stimulation and then easing into a relaxing effect? If you have, or if you've had other experiences, definitely let us know in the comments, because we always find it fascinating to know what you feel from these extracts. But let's get back to talking about the mechanisms of action.
But interesting there too is maybe with these escalating dosages, at a certain point there's not as much monoamine oxidase inhibition going on, but there's more GABA-A and GABA-B activation going on. So you start transitioning more towards GABAergic effects rather than those stimulating monoaminergic effects.
How are GABA and monoamine oxidase related to each other?
They're not.
Okay, so explain to me how, walk me back a little bit. How are they related to each other, the GABAergic effects, GABA-A, GABA-B? Just like a really quick breakdown.
Well, GABA is a neurotransmitter. It's an amino acid neurotransmitter. It's one of the main inhibitory, or what we would like in practice to call a relaxing neurotransmitter.
Is this in a similar category as norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine?
No.
Okay.
So dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin are all monoamines.
Okay.
So it's a neurotransmitter that has an amine group on it.
Okay. So
and just one, so you call them monoamine.
Monoamines, and then the GABAergics is its own category.
It's an amino acid neurotransmitter.
Yes. Okay.
And
thank you.
there's a couple of those. So the big one is GABA, which is the big inhibitory amino acid neurotransmitter. And then you have glutamate, which is the main excitatory neurotransmitter.
Okay.
Amino acid neurotransmitter.
Okay.
And then you also have glycine, which is also acting as a bit of a neurotransmitter and also has its own receptors.
Okay, so I'm just going to inject a little bit. For glutamate, glutathione,
No.
for example. No, they're not related to each other.
No.
It sounds similar, but they're not related.
No.
Okay, and then for the...
MSG, for example, which has a really bad rep, which I find very unfortunate. It's monosodium glutamate.
Okay.
And glutamic acid, it's in a lot of our foods. So soy sauce is full of glutamic acid. Any fermented food is going to be very high in glutamic acid. And this glutamic acid, when it activates receptors on your tongue, produces the sensation of umami.
Okay.
So pure umami is glutamate.
But what other supplements have glutamate? Just off the top of your head. Do we even really search for that in supplementation, or?
Usually you're trying to actually dampen glutamate activity. So, and the glutamate system is quite complex. You have a lot of different glutamate receptors, and one of the ones we're often concerned with is the NMDA glutamate receptor, or the AMPA glutamate receptor.
Okay.
NMDA is very important for long-term potentiation. So if you activate the NMDA receptor, you can actually create new neural pathways, and that is called long-term potentiation. So there's real physical changes in your brain that then help encode memories.
Okay.
And AMPA is involved there too, which interestingly, when we're most focused on NMDA, it's NMDA antagonists, because you also don't want too much NMDA activation or too much glutamatergic activity, because that can cause excitotoxicity, so it can make your brain overstimulated, basically. And that's also why there's GABA is the main inhibitory one, glutamate is the main excitatory one, and they keep each other in balance.
I see.
Which is also really interesting because glutamate turns into GABA.
Okay.
And GABA can turn into glutamate again, so they are interchangeable with each
Okay.
other too.
So these are two which are in the same category.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also mentioned glycine.
Mm-hmm.
And glycine is what's attached to magnesium glycinate, right?
Yes.
Yes,
But
okay.
glycine is also, that's not the only place where you would find glycine, of course.
But in terms of Nootropics Depot products and
Yes.
things that we can think of as practical examples, that's one really clear one. It's even in the name.
And the interesting thing about glycine and the glycine receptor is that if you look at the NMDA receptor,
Mm-hmm.
there's also a glycine receptor on the NMDA receptor. So
Okay.
if you activate glycine,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of interesting because glycine also has an inhibitory effect. It is usually relaxing, and as a neurotransmitter in the brain, it usually has an inhibitory function. But on the NMDA receptor, it acts as a co-agonist. So if you activate the glycine receptor, then the NMDA receptor becomes more sensitive, and it's more easy for that NMDA receptor to become activated and have that long-term potentiation effect. So there's, especially back in the day, and still a little bit here and there, there's people looking at compounds that specifically interact with that glycine site on the NMDA receptor as a nootropic. And that's
Okay.
also one of the reasons why I find magnesium glycinate to be interesting, because magnesium actually slots straight into the NMDA receptor. And for the NMDA receptor, it's an ionotropic receptor, which means that when it becomes activated, it changes its shape. And when it changes its shape, it can let ions like sodium or potassium or calcium in and out, and that changes the electrical gradient, and that can cause action potentials like we talked about, and that can travel through the axon of a neuron, and that can cause neurotransmitter release. So that's one of the ways, and that channel, the NMDA channel, is usually blocked by magnesium. So there's a magnesium ion in there, and if the NMDA receptor gets activated strongly enough, that magnesium gets liberated and it opens, and now ions can flow in and out, and now that system is active.
Okay.
What's interesting about magnesium is if you consume more magnesium, then it's acting as an NMDA antagonist in a sense, because it's making it less likely that the NMDA receptor will activate when it's not supposed to activate. So it kind of controls the system more. But then you add in glycine, and it also makes the receptor more sensitive. So you're kind of like fine-tuning the NMDA receptor in a sense to enhance long-term potentiation. But
Wow.
so that's we're getting kind of a neuroscience lesson at this point.
Yeah.
But if we backtrack a little bit to GABA, GABA is generally, and it's a very oversimplified system as well. There's a lot more to GABA, but in general, GABA-A and GABA-B is going to cause relaxation. Glutamatergic activation is going to cause a bit more of excitatory effects. And it's really interesting if you consider kind of the effects of ethanol. It activates GABA and it blocks NMDA receptors. So
Okay.
under the influence of ethanol, you would feel relaxed. And the NMDA receptor also controls motor coordination.
Aha.
So, and if you take enough of a GABAergic, your motor coordination will also go down. But if you then also, on top of that, block the NMDA receptor, you really start to lose motor coordination quite a bit, which is why alcohol is such a societal problem at the end of the day, because you're just knocking out your motor function. But the next day, what's kind of interesting is because you have this, especially usually if you consume alcohol, you're doing it for many, many hours at a time. And then the next day when you wake up, it will kind of be in reverse. Because
Okay.
if you're activating the GABA receptor a lot and you're blocking the NMDA receptor, the natural response to that is to upregulate the NMDA receptor because it's being blocked, and we want to overcome that, and to downregulate the GABA receptor because there's too much activation, and we want to overcome that too. So
Yeah.
the next day you're going to have more glutamate tone and less GABA tone, which could result in some nervousness. So we're usually trying to achieve the opposite side of that, where we're trying to dampen glutamate and we're trying to elevate GABA and keep those in control there.
Okay.
And that's also where things get really complicated, because serotonin, for example, if you activate the 5-HT2A receptor, which we talk about extensively in our cognance episode and our Bacopa episode, certain types of serotonin 5-HT2A receptor activation actually cause releases of glutamate, and that's important to the effects of these 5-HT2A agonists. So glutamate can also be an important part there. But as far as I know, isoliquiritigenin is not having serious effects on glutamate. It's more GABAergic, so it's going to be more calming, but it's also going to have that stimulating effect because of the monoamine oxidase inhibition. And there's 3 more interesting things that it does, which are a little bit misunderstood still, and I'm still having a hard time figuring out how exactly that slots into everything. So it's acting as a dopamine D1 antagonist.
Okay.
So usually we want to try and activate dopamine, and that's gives you motivation, a mood boost, a cognition boost. But sometimes it can also cause some weird psychological symptoms as well. Such as maybe a bit of edginess, or maybe, we won't get into much of what that does.
Okay.
It's outside of the scopes of supplements, but sometimes it's good to block the dopamine receptors and the dopamine D1 receptor. So it's kind of interesting that we're both getting an increase in dopamine because of that monoamine oxidase inhibition effect, but we're also blocking the dopamine D1 receptor, and that could have a unique calming effect as well.
Okay.
But on the flip side, it's also acting as a dopamine D3 agonist. So now you have dopamine increasing, one dopamine receptor is being blocked by isoliquiritigenin, and one is actually being activated. And the dopamine D3 receptor is very important for mood and for cognition and memory. So there's some interesting effects there too. And it's hard to figure out how exactly that balance of dopamine D1 inhibition and dopamine D3 activation is playing together, especially in context with the monoamine oxidase inhibition effects. And on top of that, isoliquiritigenin is also acting as a vasopressin 1A receptor activator, which it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what that is doing. The research on this receptor is not super fleshed out yet, but it seems to have an important effect on overall socialization. So it seems to be important there. It seems to have a link with oxytocin as well. In some studies, they think blocking the vasopressin 1A receptor is having a beneficial effect. On the other hand, you have studies looking at vasopressin 1A activation and that having positive effects. So both blockade and activation can have positive effects. And again, it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what it is doing in the context of isoliquiritigenin. But when you take everything together, it produces a really unique mood-boosting, relaxing, energizing effect. And it's definitely developing more for me now. And I this high dose is interesting. I would say I might prefer a slightly lower dose. When we've tried lower doses, it's a little bit more stimulating.
Yeah.
This definitely feels much more GABAergic.
Yes.
And something I notice with GABAergics is that the sensitivity of my fingertips tends to change. So decrease. Okay. So I notice that a little bit now. And then things like my hair can feel a little bit softer because I'm not feeling as much. Or I noticed that with most GABAergics.
Interesting.
So that's kind of an interesting effect.
Yeah.
But it also means that isoliquiritigenin is going to have a very beneficial effect if you have muscle tension, and that muscle tension is causing pain.
Yeah.
Then isoliquiritigenin can be a very interesting way of managing that pain, especially because it can help relax your muscles. And before we started recording this podcast, I think I slept a little bit wrong last night and my neck was a little bit sore, or maybe I was doing a lot of research, and because of that research, my neck was sore. But either way, now that's gone. So just the relaxing effects of that GABAergic GABA-B effect, I think is really beneficial there. So an interesting option if that's something that you're dealing with. could be a cool option to look at.
For
and
sure.
especially if you consider that isoliquiritigenin, of course, also has inflammation regulating effects. And if we go outside of the scope of the brain, and then we can also look at what it's doing in the rest of the body. So, like I mentioned earlier, GABA-B activation in the gut can actually help with motility. So it's something that a lot of people enjoy about something like apigenin or other kind of GABAergic compounds, or just GABA itself, that it can have a relaxing effect in the gut. And I think isoliquiritigenin also does that because it's going to be traveling through your gastrointestinal system, and when it's traveling through the gastrointestinal system, it can bind to GABA receptors there. So
Okay.
that can have an interesting effect.
Yeah, right to the source.
And then if we keep exploring what's happening in the rest of the body, I think what's really interesting about about isoliquiritigenin is that it's an AMPA activator. And that's something that we've looked at a lot, especially in the longevity scene. And a lot of our products are AMPA activators. Things like berberine is an AMPA activator, cycloestragenol, astragaloside 4, hesperidin, nobeletin. There's a lot of AMPA activators, and these AMPA activators can help enhance cellular energy as well. And I think that's an interesting aspect of isoliquiritigenin too, where it has these inflammation regulating effects. It upregulates NRF2, which is something that sulforaphane, for example, does. So that's one of the broccoli bioactives. And regulating NRF2 enhances the antioxidant defenses in your body.
Wow.
So it has an oxidation regulating effect, it has an inflammation regulating effect, it has that GABA effect, that GABA-B effect. So for pain, kind of an interesting option.
Absolutely.
And for longevity and just overall metabolic health, it's also interesting because of that AMPA effect, and it's also an mTORC1 inhibitor, which can also play a major role there. And so I think that's also really interesting that you have this very active compound in your brain that's also active throughout your body. And being able to provide that without the glyceric acid, which could have negative effects on our overall health. I think it's a really interesting option. And it is a bit of a goofy one. I do have to admit, like the effects are sometimes hard to integrate in a stack. We don't have it in our current stack. I do use it frequently though. So like I was mentioning, with my neck muscles being sore, I'll usually take a double dose of isoliquiritigenin, and that will kind of help relax my muscles. And it's a nice one if I'm just having some general overall tension, or I'm feeling a little bit nervous, or I'm actually feeling a little bit tired. It's a nice occasional one. And I think that concept of more occasional nootropics is really interesting. And
it's a good segue, actually.
Yeah.
If we're ready to step away from all of the intense science, well, at least just for a moment, to talk about some new supplements.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, great.
Because the new supplements that we'll be talking about are ones for us too that are definitely not in our daily stack. Because again, they can be, well, one of them is kind of in your daily stack. The other one is a little bit harder to integrate because the effects are so intense. So let's start with that one.
Yes, and just in the meantime, while Emiel is grabbing the supplement bottles, thank you for all of your listening ears, and thank you for sticking around and sharing the In Search of Insight podcast over the last 2 years. If you have just watched this really intense section about all of the different mechanisms of action of isoliquiritigenin, and you want to go back and listen again and clarify what you've learned, you can do that by going to the chapters, which are going to be in the description on the YouTube video, and they're also going to be in the description on the Spotify video as well. If you have questions about what you've learned, we always do a question and answer session on Reddit, and that's our subreddit. It's going to be r/Nootropics Depot. So we always do this kind of formal question and answer post on our subreddit, but you're also welcome to comment or post about the podcast on Reddit and let us know what you thought, let us know what you learned. If you have other interesting research that might support things, or even new research that we weren't aware of before this podcast about licorice or isoliquiritigenin, we want to know.
Yes.
So don't be shy. Definitely reach out to us. And if you want to go back through that information, check out those chapters. They're always there every single month. So, you just poured yourself some of that tonic water.
Do you want some tonic water too?
Yeah, I'm gonna finish my normal water, and then I want to try some of this tonic water.
So yeah, now we're back in Britain for a little bit.
Yes.
With that quinine, and I'm actually going to check if they put cinchona bark extract in here or if it's
something else. I'm also curious because Fever Tree tonic water is really nice, and
especially in this one. Please, Fever Tree, sponsor us so we
that
can
would
drink
be nice.
this on every episode.
But I'm curious about the ingredients that they use because they have different flavor profiles. They have different labels, and this one is the Mediterranean tonic, but I'm also familiar they have an Indian tonic as well, and I don't know what different kinds of botanicals they use for them, but in this one
they don't say. This one just says natural flavorings, but it does include, it says natural flavoring including quinine, so that means they just put quinine sulfate in here.
Yeah.
Which is why it has a very clean bitter taste, and that bitter taste is coming from the quinine.
Okay. But it's not quite as maybe peppery as the Indian one. If you're into cocktails or you're into beverages, you probably know about Fever Tree already, but it's really tasty and fun to be able to drink it along with all these other candies that we've been eating.
Or if you're into espresso tonics, which is one of my favorite summer coffee beverages.
Yes.
I find that it goes really well with the Mediterranean.
Yeah, I think the Mediterranean would be a good match for sure.
But anyways, enough reviewing Fever Tree tonic.
And talking about cocktails.
This is our spin-off YouTube channel now.
Yes.
We will do tonic water reviews.
Yeah, or just beverages in general. No, we're actually going to start by talking about a really exciting beverage that we have. And do you have the bottles?
Not a beverage?
Well, it is a beverage. You can make a beverage with it. We have a new product that we're going to talk about.
I thought we were going to talk about Kanna first.
No, we're going to talk about the other one first. We're going to talk about something that you can make into a beverage.
This is Erika's favorite, so you can explain this one.
Yes, this is really my favorite, like truly my favorite. This is the Mushroom Magic Matcha powder, which you can make into matcha tea, hot or cold.
Or with milk, and then it's kind of like a latte.
Yes.
We really like it that way.
Yes. I don't know how I did things, how I got inspiration before I tried this product. Actually, it's something that has brought so much clarity and motivation and focus for me from the first time that I tried the initial formulation. This was before the product was out and Nootropics Depot was selling it.
And it was still a different formulation with much higher caffeine levels, which you tried it out one time with slightly more than a scoop of the one with 100 milligrams of caffeine total, and that was actually too much. Yeah,
I was trying one of the earlier formulations and there was a little bit extra in the bag, and I thought let's just go for it, but it was a little bit too much caffeine. But this,
so we toned it down to 75 milligrams total. 50 milligrams is coming from caffeine anhydrous, and then the other 25 milligrams is coming from the 1 gram of matcha powder that we have in here.
Yes. So this is a green matcha powder, and it also has a variety of adaptogenic mushrooms in it, and it's tasty. There's also a little bit of sweetness to it. It tastes like matcha. I think the mushrooms bring just a slight earthiness to it when you combine it with milk.
And umami.
Yeah, and umami. When you combine it with milk, it's really, really pleasant, and you hardly taste any of that mushroom flavor at all, but it's quite rich. When you combine it with water, I think you taste just a little bit of the mushroom, but it doesn't taste strange. It's quite nice. And there's also something, a quick aside. If you've ever drank green tea before, and you wanted to kind of increase or sort of turn up the volume on the umami flavors of the green tea, we've experimented by adding MSG to green tea. Just plain green tea, and it can make all of those flavors, like the toasty, warm flavors, really come out. So I think it's interesting.
And just to go in on that a little bit more, the interesting thing about that, if you take L-theanine powder and you just taste plain L-theanine, it's also umami.
Yes.
And it's because L-theanine is actually very closely related to GABA and glutamate. And that's also part of how it affects our mental well-being, is it upregulates GABAergic activity a little bit, and it downregulates glutamatergic activity a little bit. But it has an umami taste. And in very high quality matcha, which this is definitely not super high quality matcha.
This is not ceremonial grade matcha.
Well, okay. We have to talk about the ceremonial grade thing because...
Okay, but finish what you were going to say
before. The ceremonial grade thing is important
right,
because we've had a lot of people asking, is it ceremonial grade? In our research, a lot of the team members that didn't know about matcha yet, they're, is it ceremonial grade? Ceremonial grade means nothing. It is not a real thing.
Oh?
You can call any matcha ceremonial grade.
Okay.
There's no certification program that says, for example, you can only make champagne in Champagne if it's made out of these grapes. Or it can only be Parmigiano Reggiano if it's coming from this area and this milk and it's made in this way. There's nothing about that.
So there isn't a regulation then?
There's no regulation. So basically, if you're looking at other competing products, they will tell you most of the time that it's ceremonial grade matcha, even though it's probably not even as good as the matcha we're putting in here. It's not, when I say it's not high quality matcha, it's not like gourmet level. It's not, you're going to mix it up and you're going to have this flavor explosion.
Mm-hmm. If you were to go to a traditional matcha tea ceremony, you would be getting a higher quality of matcha. It's also way more expensive and it's way more fine. So in this case, we have a matcha which is very tasty. Mm-hmm. It's very functional, especially when you combine it with other ingredients like these mushrooms.
And it's not super expensive because if you look at real ceremonial grade, but if you just look at it like high quality coffee or like high quality matcha, it's the same thing like if you call McDonald's coffee or something normal coffee, but then you get coffee from your local roastery and you call it ceremonial grade coffee. That'd be strange.
Yeah.
There's probably some place on earth where they're using it in a coffee in a ceremonial way, but you're just going to call it high quality coffee.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing with matcha. There's not really an agreed upon concept of what ceremonial grade is. So I think that's just an important aside. Yeah. We've been offered ceremonial grade and we've talked to matcha suppliers about, is there anything to the ceremonial grade? And they basically said to us, it's all bullshit.
Okay.
You can basically call anything ceremonial grade. And we see that with other things in the supplement world too, where, this is pharma grade. Mm-hmm. Pharma grade also doesn't mean anything. Okay. Everything should be pharma grade. If it's not pharma grade, if it's not pharma grade, you shouldn't be putting it in your body.
Yeah.
The whole concept behind pharma grade is that it is basically safe to use. It is what it is, and it's of high purity.
Yeah.
So we could say that all of our products are pharma grade products, technically, because they're all of a high purity, and we're testing it, and it's consistent. So everything that would be pharma grade. But pharma grade, it's just a marketing term.
Yeah.
It works. It gets a lot of people, I only take pharma grade supplements. If you buy from us, you're taking pharma grade supplements. And it's the same with ceremonial grade. It's also a bit of like a cultural appropriation thing, right? Where, they do ceremonies in Japan with matcha tea. So there must be some sort of spiritual component of it that we can exploit a little bit. So let's start calling it ceremonial grade, and people can feel good about themselves that they're... And it works.
Or
it works
that they're
in a marketing
experiencing
sense.
Something which would be similar to the real thing.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm not making a tea ceremony with this. I don't know how to do that.
Which, by the way, if you ever get a chance to do a matcha tea ceremony, it's fantastic.
I would
Go
really
do
like
it.
to sometime.
I did one time in Japan. It was a really amazing experience. And again, if you look on the menu, it's not saying ceremonial grade matcha. You're just paying wads of cash
for really good matcha for a ceremony.
And the really good matcha too, like if we really start digging into it, the good stuff, and this is the important thing that I was trying to get to, is good matcha. You can basically take any green tea, powderize it, and it's basically matcha, because there's some cultivars that are specific to matcha production, but in general that's not happening unless you get into the higher echelon of matcha. And it's being shade grown, which not all matcha powders on the market, and probably not all of the ceremonial grade stuff, is being properly shade grown. But if you go higher and higher in the matcha world, then it is extensively shade grown. And when you do that, less of the chlorophyll degrades. So it's really bright green. So if you look at very high quality matcha versus not very high quality matcha, you see a definite difference in the vibrancy of the green. But what you also notice is more umami taste in the higher quality matcha. And you also have this with Gyokuru tea, I think, is also just tea leaves that are shade grown. And they have higher levels of L-theanine. And because L-theanine is umami, higher quality matcha or Gyokuru tea gets more and more umami, which is also why we've experimented with both adding L-theanine and MSG to tea, and it makes a big difference. But
all that being said,
babbling aside,
it does relate to the flavor experience of this powder, which is that the mushrooms and the mushroom powder that's in here also adds a little bit of that umami flavor.
And we actually did a lot of testing with higher end matchas, which would have significantly, like maybe even doubled the price of this. And we kind of just played around with it for fun. It's not going to be possible to sell this at maybe double the price. It's just not going to be worth it, because you might as well just be selling straight matcha then, so you're not messing up the interesting matcha flavor with mushrooms. And we actually found that when we went higher and higher, if we tasted the matcha pure, it was super interesting. If we added it to the mushroom magic matcha, it became a little bit messy in terms of flavor. The flavors of the mushrooms were not cooperating with the flavors of the matcha, because the matcha was pulling a lot of attention to itself. It didn't really result in anything nice. So, but the matcha that's in here actually is organic matcha. It's high quality, it tastes pleasant, and it tastes like nice and neutral, and it blends well with the effects or the taste of the mushrooms.
Yes.
But more importantly is that it contains quite a bit of polyphenols, and it's being standardized for that. And we are testing the caffeine concentration, so we can actually use that caffeine concentration and then adjust our caffeine anhydrous amount to then get it up to 75 milligrams. So I think that's really nice.
Yeah.
And just to the actual mushrooms that are in here, we made a blend, and we played around with this a lot too. We wanted to put poria mushroom in there, and we also talked about this earlier with licorice. Licorice is often being combined with poria mushroom for some reason. And we find that poria mushroom has a really interesting mood-boosting effect, and this is partially our fault that we don't really talk about poria mushroom enough, but it's one of the least popular mushrooms around. Just generally in the whole mushroom world, you don't see much talk about poria. There's not a lot of poria products out there. There is now a guy in the US, which, if you're interested in mushroom cultivation, go follow Terrestrial Fungi. He does a lot of cultures, and especially for cordyceps and reishi, and he recently started growing poria. And like tiger milk mushroom, which is also in here, it's a sclerotium.
Okay.
So we have two sclerotium products, which you hardly ever see sclerotium products. You hardly ever see tiger milk mushroom and poria mushroom, but we decided to put them both in here. One, because poria has really interesting mood benefits, which Erika can attest to later, and tiger milk mushroom, which I find has very interesting focus enhancing effects. And then we rounded it out with two more normal-ish mushrooms, cordyceps and lion's mane.
Yes.
But really high quality fruiting body, whole fruiting body. So none of these are extracts, which I also find interesting. So it's all full spectrum, but they've all been tested properly. It's all fruiting body. There's no mycelium on grain, which with a lot of the competing products out on the market, you'll just see mycelium on grain being put in there. It's usually being hidden behind a proprietary blend, so you can't actually see how much it is. And oftentimes there's actually not that many mushrooms in there. Here we're putting in not for the tiger milk. The tiger milk is not a total full dose. It's a little bit less, and we actually found that with the lesser dose, it worked really nicely, and putting in the double dose didn't make enough of a difference to justify the cost of adding more tiger milk in there, so that 150 milligram dose was a really nice complement to everything else in there. But other than the tiger milk, everything is at just a full dose that you would get with our... So you're getting 3 mushrooms at a full dose and 1 mushroom at a half dose. And you usually don't find that either. Like maybe there's a gram total of mushrooms being put in there. Here you have just, or maybe even less than a gram total. But here you actually have full doses of each, which I think really adds to the overall effects profile. And then some caffeine anhydrous. So it's pretty simple. Matcha, which has effects. You have things like EGCG in there, epicatechin in there, which can have beneficial effects. You have some naturally derived caffeine. And then you have the effects from the mushrooms and the effects from the caffeine. And it's all coming together very nicely. And it works well for me, but you've really been having some like mind-blowing results with it.
Yes. I'm very excited to tell you about it. The first time I took this version of the Mushroom Magic Matcha, I felt really calm quite quickly. I made it in a warm tea. I felt focused. It definitely has a physical relaxing effect for me, but it also has a very, very powerful emotional effect. Depending on the kind of stressors in my life, sometimes I find that I cry easily. And sometimes this is when I listen to a really beautiful song, or if I read a really sweet message from a friend, or I'm riding my bike and looking at the sky. It could happen in a quiet moment of awe and wonder. And sometimes that kind of moment triggers this feeling that I want to cry. It makes me cry, like happy tears. But I don't always feel like that's the appropriate. It's not always comfortable. Sometimes it can be distracting. And when I took this matcha, I found that this kind of unwieldy response, this unwieldy emotional response to like beautiful good things, was kind of put into this container where I could feel this warmth, or I could experience this music, or I could like go through my day or my activity and not feel that I went over a certain threshold emotionally. And I haven't experienced this kind of emotional effect from any other supplement before. This is the first product that I've tried which really feels that it's like a warm hug, but it also holds things in a good way. In a way that makes it possible to like experience emotions and experience a good mood without it getting into this like uncontrollable territory. And I found that really fascinating. Another thing I found really fascinating is that I've been drinking this matcha when I practice at my studio space. And the first time I tried this matcha when I was practicing, I felt really physically relaxed. I definitely felt that I could focus on my practice. But I also started to feel, as I got more warmed up and into my practice session, that I could play all of the things that were in my mind in a way that felt so natural and so fluid. And I wasn't making mistakes. I was trying new things. I was taking more risks. And I was basically sticking my landings with all of these new kind of techniques that I was practicing. And that was an amazing experience, because sometimes I find that my focus gets interrupted when I start to overly critique myself, or I react to, a note being not perfectly in tune. But something in this matcha, something in this effects profile allowed me to push beyond just exercises that I had done previously to try something new. And then it actually felt good, and I was able to play really confidently and consistently, which, it feels like kind of like a secret weapon now. So if anyone is curious about trying the Mushroom Magic Matcha, if you have tried it before, definitely give it a go. It's really special, and Emiel has had some good effects from it. For me, it's something that
It's not as
entirely-
pronounced for me,
yeah.
by the way. It's
Yeah.
For me, it's a nice boost. It feels more potent than I would imagine 75 milligrams of caffeine to feel, because when we first started beta testing it and we were thinking, do we even add caffeine? I was immediately saying we should, because a lot of these alternatives on the market, they say, wow, it contains a quarter the amount of a cup of coffee. Who really wants that? If you're going for a caffeinated beverage,
Mm-hmm. maybe
we'll come out with a completely non-caffeinated one at some point. But
Yeah.
having these really low amounts of caffeine, I don't think it's that interesting. So actually going a bit more functional. 75 milligrams seemed a little bit low. I suggested 100 milligrams when we were beta testing the 100 milligrams. 100 milligrams felt surprisingly strong in the context of these mushrooms.
Yeah.
So when we dialed it back, the effects are really nice. So it's good for me, because usually I'll have a cup of coffee in the afternoon if I'm feeling low energy. But that can sometimes overstimulate me, because I don't have I can handle a lot of caffeine without issues, but I don't enjoy high amounts of caffeine. So usually I drink 1 cup of coffee in the afternoon, or 1 cup of coffee in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, but I prefer to have something else. And Mushroom Magic Matcha is one of those interesting products now that I'm not every afternoon, but sometimes take a little dose of that. It's a smoother way to enhance my energy, and I feel like it lasts a little bit longer, and it's better at dialing in my focus. Sometimes I'll drink a cup of coffee in the afternoon and feel a little bit overstimulated and then get distracted. When I take Mushroom Magic Matcha, it's easier for me to focus. So for me, maybe the effects don't sound as pronounced and exciting as they do for Erika, but it's super functional.
Yeah.
And one thing I really like about it is that you are getting those full doses of mushrooms. So especially now that the weather is getting colder and you go everywhere and everyone's coughing and sniffling, it's nice to have that immune boosting potential of those mushrooms in there. So I think it's a really interesting product for that. And
For sure.
especially one of our first products where we thought, okay, now we can come out with a scoop, which again, we're not fans of scoops usually, because most of our products have very low dosages in powders. You just can't accurately measure that consistently with a scoop, in our opinion. But something like this, we calibrated the scoop, we made sure that it fit in there. It's a high dose, so if you're 50 milligrams over or under, it's not a huge deal. If you're 50 milligrams over or under with isoliquiritigenin, though,
You're gonna notice it.
that's not good. So for that kind of stuff, use a scale. For here, we have a scoop, so that's really nice.
For the first time.
And again, you can still use a scale with this and really calibrate your dose. So you could say, okay, I want a double scoop, get 150 milligrams of caffeine in, which I've done multiple times. And I really like that as like a more of a pre-workout type of thing. Or you can say, I actually want it right at about 100 milligrams of caffeine. And then you do what, like 1 1/4-ish scoop?
Yeah.
So you can play around with it if you have a scale. But if you're just out and about, toss one in your bag. You have one at your studio, and we have one at home.
I have two jars because it's something that I don't want to miss, especially for the kind of really focused and intense, like creative and physical work that goes into practicing and making music. So that's one of the new products that came out since our last podcast episode, the Mushroom Magic Matcha.
We're also working on another one, which will be more in the coffee realm. So
stay tuned for that.
Stay tuned for that.
Yes.
I'm personally more excited about that one because it's going to be a bit more stimulating, which I might regret saying that once we try it, because I do really love the effects of the Mushroom Magic Matcha because it is smoother.
Yeah.
But sometimes, and actually, this is kind of interesting. In the winter, I actually like to keep it a bit more chill on the caffeine. But in the summer, I like to pound the caffeine because maybe it's like the diuretic effect or something like that. I feel like it keeps me a little bit more cool, perhaps.
Could be, for sure. You're also just a coffee fiend, so I can understand that you're excited for this thing that's coming in the future.
Yes.
Okay, so now let's talk about the other exciting new product that came out since our last podcast episode, and this one is truly exciting, and we also have some fun anecdotes to share about this, and it is the full spectrum Kanna tablets.
And this is I think you're probably the most excited about the Mushroom Magic Matcha release.
Yeah.
I'm definitely the most excited about the Kanna release.
Mm-hmm.
And these are nice little rattly capsules, so because we're still recording in stereo.
Oh, yeah. Feel the Kanna. Taste the Kanna.
There. So we tested a lot of Kanna, and we'll do a whole separate podcast and blog about Kanna. Actually, I already did a blog about Kanna. That's up. Go read it.
Yes, but I think a podcast would be really fun.
We'll do a podcast about it because there's a lot to talk about. But it took us a really long time. We carried Kanna in the past, Zembrin, and we kind of we didn't like Zembrin. Zembrin's a very weak extract. I think they did a lot of important things for the Kanna world because they did a lot of research. They figured out how to standardize things. They use different cultivars that are conducive to having slightly higher mesembrine levels. So there is some really interesting stuff going on with Zembrin, but it clumped up really badly. It was really expensive. None of our customers were super huge fans of it either. So at a certain point, we just phased Zembrin out. And then we wanted to do Kanna, but Kanna is actually really hard to source. So we talked about this with Lucas as well on our previous episode. Mm-hmm. Sourcing anything from the African continent is hard. And with something like Kanna, it's really hard because it's a difficult plant to grow. It's a difficult plant to process. But for the last 10 months or so, we tried, I think, almost 10, maybe even more than 10 different extracts. We kept trying them, and during this time I also had a very high dose of Kanna, which we also talked about with Lucas, so I won't reiterate that here. And most of them were kind of a letdown. And then there was one bag that I hadn't tried, and it kind of got stuck behind some other samples, and for some reason Paul hadn't tried it either, and I thought, I grabbed this sample, I thought, I'll try this one. I'll try a slightly higher dose of it. Because I just haven't been that impressed, and I had to sit down. I think I tried 100 milligrams sublingually, and it hit me so hard, and I looked in the mirror, and my pupils were dilated, and I thought, whoa, this is different. And I just to rule out if it was me having some kind of freak reaction, I asked Paul if he wanted to try it, and he did, and he said the same thing, this is super intense. I had to sit down for a sec. Because we had tried all of these somewhat more lackluster extracts. Once they're really high in mesembrine, which those high mesembrine extracts, a lot of people will claim mesembrine is the only alkaloid you want, and mesembrine is going to give you that uplifted, stimulating effect, which is definitely true, but it kind of only gives you that, and it can feel cold and clinical. And I don't like that with Kanna. When I tried Kanna many, many years ago, I was trying a more full-spectrum Kanna, and it had this physically relaxing but mentally stimulating effect. And I wanted to get back to that, and this extract does that. So I was really stoked to find this one. And it's a bit more full-spectrum, and it has higher levels of delta-7 mesembrine, and I think that's kind of important for our effects profile. So I really love it, and it's strong. But we decided to go with a 50 milligram tablet that you could dissolve in your mouth, because when you use it sublingually, it has the strongest effect. And it can kick in as little as 5 minutes. You can really start feeling something. And at 50 milligrams, it's pretty intense, but we have a lot of customers who sometimes, we'll bring out something like Tribugen, and they'll say, this isn't shit. I don't feel anything from it. I want it even stronger. Well, we released Tribulus, which we thought was really strong. People wanted it even stronger. We made Tribugen, which we thought was crazy strong, and some people still don't think it's strong enough. Maniacs. We made Dynamax, which we thought was really strong, and then we had a bunch of people saying, it's not really strong enough. So we came out with Dynamax Plus, which is really almost irresponsibly strong in my opinion, but it works really well. I like that one a lot. But because of that, and we have a big customer base who wants really pronounced effects, we decided, okay, we'll go with that 50 milligram dose. There's almost no way you can take the Kanna and not notice anything. How I like using it though, and we could have also done 25 milligram tablets, but then you have to spend more money on making more tablets for the same amount of doses, and the tablets are bigger, and you actually want something a little bit smaller to dissolve under your tongue or in your mouth. So being able to snap the tablets in half is really nice. So these are scored, and the way I like using them is 25 milligrams, let it dissolve, have the effects kick in, and then about 30 minutes later, when the effects of that first tablet are almost at the peak effects, then I take the other 25 milligram tablet, and then that adds to it, and it extends the effects profile. And I find that that effects profile setting in at 25 milligrams and then another 25 milligrams is smoother and less jarring, more mood boosting, longer lasting.
Compared to taking the whole tablet at once.
Okay. So
Okay.
I like using it like that. I use it multiple times a week, not every day, but especially when I'm doing some research and I'm a little bit mentally tired, or I'm just not that interested in doing it. Kanna is a great one, especially at that 25 milligram dose, to kind of get a motivating mood boost. The other day I took it when I was doing some cleaning, some vacuuming. I really didn't feel like doing it. Took a 25 milligram tablet, and 10 minutes later I was jamming out with some music on, vacuuming the floor. So
It's great.
good for motivation,
Yeah.
especially because it kicks in so quickly, but also for mood and for music appreciation. So
For sure.
recently we went to a local club here in town, and went to some really intense electronic music, and I snuck some of those tablets in, which you're allowed to do that, but it just looks sketchy.
It does. It looks
because
sketchy.
It looks like you're bringing in hard drugs because they're
Mm-hmm.
pressed tablets, so it probably looks like ecstasy or something like that, which it's not. But you kind of have to be careful with that.
Yeah.
I wish I could just bring in this bottle, but I'm sure if they open that up and they look in it, they'll think I'm a mass drug dealer.
Yeah. Perhaps the security at the clubs aren't so familiar with Kanna.
No.
Anywho.
But every half hour, 45 minutes or so, we took a half tablet, and it really had a nice effect on physical energy and mental endurance, and just overall, like, the enjoyment of the music was enhanced. And
Yeah.
I never felt tired, even when it was 6 a.m.
It was a late one.
Yeah, it was late.
I found it so awesome to take the Kanna and then dance. I mean, I don't think I danced like that in quite some time. I was sweating. It was really, really fun. And it also made it a little bit more relaxing to be in a big crowd of people. I think it's possible that it also changes my perception of music, or maybe makes me a little bit more sensitive to sound. But we always wear hearing protection when we go out and see like heavy music, especially electronic music, because oftentimes it's just way too loud and you're going to get hearing damage. But I found that I could handle the intensity of the environment, and I could really enjoy myself, and it kept my energy levels up. It was really, really cool to take the Kanna in that environment. And yeah, being able to just dance and feel relaxed and to have all of that energy through your entire body was a really interesting experience. So
Yeah.
this is a super fun one.
And I'm sure it would actually stack quite well with isoliquiritigenin.
Yeah, definitely. So we have the Mushroom Magic Matcha, we have the Kanna. We talked really at length about isoliquiritigenin and all of its beneficial effects for mood. And we also had such a fun time eating those candies and telling you about the history of licorice, especially in the Netherlands, and, licorice extracts that turned into this kind of soothing but also comforting candy that's used all around the world. We didn't go so much into the traditional uses from Chinese practices, but the way that a lot of people know licorice is by candy, and so we're just reaching a little bit further back, but also locally, to talk about how it was made in Italy and how we're eating it now in the Netherlands. And
that's, I think this is a kind of a funny story.
yeah,
That's a lot of licorice products that I bought, right? Like, just hands full. And I
Yes.
bought it at one shop, just down the street from us. I didn't have to go and Google crazy stuff and order something online. It's just really easy. Get my licorice. But I was kind of nervous going up to the counter that Dutch people love to kind of jab fun jokes at you, like, oh, what you're gonna do with all that licorice kind of feeling. So I had this whole story in my mind, like, oh, I'm doing a podcast about the history of licorice and stuff like that. But I didn't totally feel like having that conversation. So I was a bit nervous that the cashier was gonna say something, and I didn't. It's like the most normal thing ever to buy.
How many varieties? Like 6 varieties of licorice.
To me, that's a ridiculous one variety and amount of licorice. Like, no one has any business buying that amount of licorice all at once.
Yeah.
Unless you have a huge family of...
or you're having a big party.
Or a big... Well,
yeah.
who's having licorice at their party? But...
I mean, why wouldn't you have licorice at your party, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But I thought it was kind of funny that you can just... It's so normal. People eat so much licorice. And I always remember my grandpa had a jar of licorice, and he would always... You were allowed to have 2. He was definitely having more than 2. But every day he ate 2 pieces of licorice, and it was a tradition. And till the day he died, he had severe Parkinson's and everything like that, and sometimes really lost the plot a little bit with all of the medication. But there was one constant, and it was that licorice. Till when he was 93 years old, every single day, out of that same tin that he'd probably had for like 60 years. So it's an important part of Dutch culture, clearly.
For sure, yeah.
And I think it's interesting that we can share that, especially being in the Netherlands and having such easy access to all of these licorice products. And now Isoliquiritigenin, which is definitely something that I take every once in a while, and maybe it would be interesting to play around with it in a stack for longer term.
Yeah.
I just haven't figured out how exactly it slots into our stack yet.
Mm-hmm. So we hope you try Isoliquiritigenin. We hope that you have good effects from it. But regardless of what the experience is like for you, we always want to hear about it. And we also want to hear your thoughts about the podcast. And we also want to hear about your thoughts about future podcasts or other products that you want us to talk about. So please interact with us on YouTube and on Spotify and on Reddit. Our subreddit is r/Nootropics Depot. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for sticking with us and for supporting the In Search of Insight podcast. You can find all of the links to the products that we discussed today, as well as the podcast chapters in the description. And we're going to have another wonderful and fun and cozy episode coming for you next month, talking about botanicals and supplements. So please stick around and share the podcast with your friends. Until next time, that's it for today. We'll say bye-bye. Bye.
See ya.